Movie Health podcast is proudly supported by Telemoods by eClapper Project Inc. Telemoods recommends which movies and TV series to watch by matching the user's mood and real-time offer of all streaming platforms. Download Telemoods today. Hi, this is AJ and welcome to the Movie Health podcast. We talk about movies and mental health. In this episode, we have Kieren Dell, CEO of Majestic Cinemas. Welcome, Kieran.
Thank you, AJ.
Thank you for taking the time to talk about movies and mental health. Now, we typically interview healthcare professionals, and so this is a first time talking with someone from the cinema industry. So I'd love to hear, given your background and experience, what is your favorite movie?
Yeah, my favorite movie, and it dates back importantly to just before I bought my first cinema, so it dates back 22 years, is the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings. In fact, the whole series, but first one specifically.
So as the first one?
You can't take them as one, it's a series, so you got to take them all. But the first one was the one that really stunned me initially.
And so were you a Tolkien fan? Had you read the book?
Yeah, I was a Tolkien tragic through my my teen years. I read The Hobbit fairly young. I remember having a tape recording, that's how old I am, tape recording 16 tapes of The Hobbit that my mother got me. I was never been good at audio books, so I preferred to read it anyway, which I did, and read The Lord of the Rings probably at the age of about 12 or 13 and probably read it half a dozen times in my teens.
So, Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring. So I suppose I'll provide a bit of a synopsis on the movie. In short, the movie came out in 2001. It's rated PG, just under 3 hours long, directed by Peter Jackson from the book from J.R.R. Tolkien. Peter Jackson actually co-wrote the film with Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens. It has many stars: Elijah Wood, Ian McKellen, Orlando Bloom, and it keeps going. Sean Bean, Sean Astin, Kate Blanchett, and Viggo Morrison. Andy Serkis as Gollum, quite famously. Who haven't I mentioned? Christopher Lee as Saradam. It's remarkable, the ensemble of this cast. So the storyline of Lord of the Rings is an ancient ring thought to have been lost for centuries has been found, and through a strange twist of fate has been given to a small hobbit named Frodo, the Elijah Wood character. When Gandalf discovers the ring is in fact the one ring of the Dark Lord Saradam, Frodo must take an epic quest to the cracks of doom in order to destroy it. However, he does not go alone. He is joined by Gandalf, Legolas the elf, Gimli the dwarf, Aragorn, Boromir, and his three hobbit friends, Merry, Pippin, and Samwise. Through the mountains, snow, darkness, forests, rivers, and plains, facing evil and danger at every corner, the Fellowship of the Ring must go onwards. A quest to destroy the One Ring is the only hope for the end of the Dark Lord's reign. Yeah, it's a mixture of action, adventure, drama, fantasy. However, I would say it's quite strong on fantasy. Famously filmed in New Zealand, won 4 Oscars. An Oscars in cinematography, in musical score. And you can certainly remember the score of that film. It's very large and cosmic and really brings home the fantasy genre. And for me, Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, the first of the trilogy, like the other two, is a very standalone movie. You know, you could certainly watch the first, learn a lot about the characters, the world that they're operating in, and really be absorbed by the story. I would probably say that the first is also my favorite, just given how you're thrust. I remember when Lord of the Rings came out. I remember seeing it at the cinemas. I remember being such a huge movie, released around the same time as Matrix, or a couple of years after Matrix, around the same time as Harry Potter. It was a massive time in cinema, and it was such a huge film that I think, even though it's 20 odd years since the movie has been released, it's definitely a movie that you can go and revisit, and certainly considered, along with the other two movies, an all-time classic in the genre, an adaptation of a well-known book.
I think your point is right, is that for me, Tolkien was the pinnacle of fantasy. And I read a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, particularly as a teenager, and they'd never been able to translate that onto the big screen. You know, I probably would have seen during the 80s and 90s, and before that, a lot of the fantasy films that had come out. And they were pretty cheesy, most of them. I can't even remember the names of most of them. They're that memorable. So I would have seen all of that. And to be honest with you, when The Lord of the Rings came out, and I didn't own cinemas at that point, didn't even know that I would. A year later, I did own a cinema when the second one came out. But at the time, I didn't, so had no connections to the industry. And I remember I was living on the north coast of New South Wales. I was in Sydney for Christmas visiting my family. I knew The Lord of the Rings was coming out. There was an animated version from Ralph Bakshi, I think, sometime in the 70s when I was a teenager. It only went 2/3 of the way through. It was pretty average, and it was sort of this weird animated version. So I had a bad experience with Lord of the Rings on the big screen. So my first reaction when it came out on Boxing Day was, I'm not going to bother going and seeing that. Much as a Tolkien fan as I am, I don't want the film to spoil it for me. And then word started to trickle out that Peter Jackson's actually done something pretty extraordinary here. He's actually captured The Lord of the Rings on film as it should be. And so intrigued when I got back home, which is probably a week after it had released. So, here's the Tolkien tragic, waited over a week, which I wouldn't normally have done. I decided I would go and see it. So I went and saw it by myself at the local cinema in Nambucca Heads, which a year later we owned. And I went and watched it and was absolutely blown away by the fact that he managed to translate what was in all of our heads onto the screen. And to do it looking so magnificent was the first thing to blow it away. I love the story and lots of things of the story, but the fact that he did that. I then went and got my wife and my two young kids, who I think were about 9 and 11 at the time, and I forced them to come and watch it with me, and watched it again probably 2 days later. I was that impressed with it.
Sir Peter Jackson, we must say, he really made his name from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I mean, it was actually, I think that I read on IMDb, the first person to direct 3 major films simultaneously: Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and Return of the King. And they were nominated from a slew of awards, from Golden Globe, Oscars, BAFTAs, and somehow Peter Jackson managed to follow up the Lord of the Rings trilogy. In 2005, he directed, wrote, and produced King Kong with Universal Pictures. And that was a huge film at its time. I think that movie grossed over $500 million and won 3 Oscars by itself. Yeah, Peter Jackson previously received widespread acclaim for, I think it was his 1994 feature film, Heavenly Creatures. He received an Oscar nomination for that one, Best Screenplay. And he's done other films over the years: Frighteners, starring Michael J. Fox; Brain Dead, which was one of his original, was his independent films. And he's done some TV as well. He later partnered with Steven Spielberg's, remember, with the Adventures of Tintin, The Secret of the Unicorn, 2011. Yeah, I think he's then moved on to a lot more production. So, being involved in quite a few documentary productions. He did the remarkable documentary in, a couple of years ago, The Beatles Get Back, where he directed and produced that. That was unbelievable. That was, around 6 hours of footage that was condensed down from, I think 70 or so, just a remarkable amount of film into a concise series about how the Beatles made that particular album. Yeah, and he writes a lot of his scripts with his partner, Fran Walsh.
Yeah, it's basically a hero story that has themes of resurrection. And Tolkien was a devout Christian. It has a lot of a background in Norse mythology. He was a professor of mythology, created his own language, his own peoples, and it's a very intricate story. But the story in the first of the 3 books really is the forming of a fellowship to basically save the world from all the different races on the good side of good versus evil. And it's a good versus evil story at the end of the day. And they all come together as a group. And as you say, at the end of the first book and the first movie, that fellowship splinters for various reasons. And the next 2 movies basically see you changing between different groups of the fellowship, all going their own way and all playing their own part in the ultimate victory over evil. I don't think that's a spoiler. I think we all know that good was going to beat evil in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was also a movie that launched the careers of many of the actors as well. Elijah Wood being Frodo, what the main Hobbit in Lord of the Rings. A few other familiar actors' names: Sam, his best friend.
Yeah, I can't think of the actor's name, actually.
Famous for Goonies. Should have had it ready to fire. And the other thing that I remember from Lord of the Rings is the music, the score. I believe it was Enya that was quite involved in the development of the score for Lord of the Rings. I was actually listening to Enya recently, and music, classic music from Lord of the Rings that are used throughout Fellowship of the Rings came on. I was like, yeah, I know. I either know what part of the movie that was from, or yeah, that's Lord of the Rings. Classic Enya, classic movie score.
So yes, it did launch a whole lot of careers, as well as Peter Jackson, as you said. He was a independent filmmaker, so he was a big risk for the studio to give a huge budget to. So no one was quite sure there. Yeah, it had some established actors, people like Ian McKellen as Gandalf, and so on, and Sean Bean, who went on to be in Game of Thrones and a whole lot of things for many years. But it also introduced people like Elijah Wood, as you said, Orlando Bloom as the elf, Sean Astin was Sam, and Andy Serkis famously as Gollum. Viggo Mortensen was his first major role as Aragorn. You had Kate Blanchett, Ian Holm, lots of great older actor as well as some new ones. And some of them had made their careers. For some of them, it was topping off the end of their career.
And it was probably the start of the Sean Bean, of him always famously dying within a movie or a TV series.
And again, spoilers on this one, he died at the end of the first movie. So it wasn't the start of it, but that was the character arc that his character had to take.
And, that, I don't know about you, but going back to that feeling of dread, I think that, the opening of Lord of the Rings, you really feel immersed in the world that Tolkien had created in his books. And Peter Jackson and crew really, recreated that world, all filmed in New Zealand, and the sets are remarkable. The CGI really holds up, given how old it is. But, you're introduced to the world of the hobbits, and you meet Gandalf, the Gandalf the Great, the wizard that supports Frodo with his pulling together the Fellowship to support, their journey for the ring. But as I said, I think as the story progresses, you feel this real sense of alarm or concern that something bad is going to happen.
It's all built about that huge battle with evil, so it's inevitable. And Gandalf, many people think Frodo is the main character, but in actual fact, Gandalf is the manipulator of everything. So he's actually the key character, as it turns out.
Is that right?
I believe he's the key to the movie. He's the one who, and again, spoilers, but the book's 100 years old and the movie's been out for 20 odd years. Yeah, he's the one who dies and is resurrected. He's the Christ-like figure. Yeah, he's the real leader of it all. Yeah, and all the others, Frodo included, are all his tools to battle evil.
And we didn't mention in terms of the cast, but John Rhys Davies.
And some great Australian actors in there as well. Hugo Weaving plays Elrond. I think in the later movies, you had, what's his name? Played Dan the Diver. In later movies, David Wenham was in there as Sean Bean's brother. There were a great Australian cast. And the fact that it was made in New Zealand was a huge thing for the New Zealand film industry at the time. And it sort of rubbed off a little bit on Australia and many of the Australian actors.
And also by being set in New Zealand, it kicked off, well, I think Peter Jackson's production company is Wingnut. And that also, the innovation that had occurred in the reproduction of the world, but also, the creation of Gollum as a creature, gave birth to CGI powerhouse in New Zealand, being Wingnut.
And not just CGI, but actually special effects more so than CGI. CGI's done a whole lot of different things. I think Wingnut's his production company. Weta Studios is the place it's made. And I recently got the chance a couple of times to go to New Zealand. Weta Studios is in Wellington, and I visited it. Absolutely spectacular. You see all of the prosthetics, and for orcs, who are the baddies, of course, and others. You see all of that at Weta Studios. There's a huge, big exhibition permanently there. Absolutely worth seeing. And I got to go to Hobbiton, which is on the South Island, on the North Island as well, in the Rotorua. And I got to visit Hobbiton, and you can go into the Hobbit burrows and you can walk around and just see how we created this whole real landscape. So a lot of it wasn't CGI. A lot of it was he did it on this farm in the middle of New Zealand, and he made the Shire for the hobbits there, and he did a whole lot of special effects, as I said, rather than CGI, I suppose.
Special effect, yeah, exactly. In particular, with those practical effects, the hawks that feature quite heavily throughout the trilogy, a pretty fierce, intimidating, scary creation. I remember seeing a statue of one somewhere, and Yeah, pretty scary stuff. And they were done so effectively in the films and legitimately frightening, I think, to watch on screen and have as this evil force that is a continuous threat and, come in different forms, shapes, and sizes. I think after watching all three recently, you can definitely see, mentioned the indie filmmaking that Peter Jackson started out in. I remember a movie he did in the 80s, Bad Taste, which was, basically this rambling story of combination of UFOs and freaky creatures. So you can really see that with a bit more money and more creativity, he was able to really realize different types of creatures as well, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, I think the movie that got him the job was, I think from memory, one called Beautiful Creatures or something like that. That was his sort of audition for it, which again was a small budget independent movie, but that obviously caught a few people's eye. But he'd made a few small movies before this. But and since then, of course, he's gone on to make things like King Kong and some, obviously the Hobbit movies, which I didn't like as much as Lord of the Rings. I think he mucked that one up a little bit.
Well, he was supposed to direct the Hobbit trilogy, was he? It was...
No, he was supposed to produce it. Yeah.
Del Toro. Yeah, the Spanish guy. Del Toro? No.
Guillermo del Toro was lined up to do it. And then the fact that they made 3 movies out of a book that's smaller than any one of the volumes of Lord of the Rings made no sense to us purists. They also released it, to get technical here, in high frame rate, which took away some of the mystery and made it too real and got behind some special effect. And that was a bit of a mistake. Not that many people saw it in that format, but still it was... he was experimenting. And if Peter Jackson hadn't done what he did for the New Zealand film industry, and you've got to argue that the Australian industry benefits from that somehow as well, you wouldn't have seen Avatar and James Cameron go to New Zealand and all those things that have come out of that since then. So he's absolutely a pioneer.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to backtrack, but I'll add this in somewhere. I think Peter Jackson's Hollywood break, which I should have had written down, was actually Frighteners in the late 90s that starred Michael J. Fox, which by memory was quite good. I think a movie that not everyone will associate with Peter Jackson, nor... So Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, first in the trilogy. I remember how that made me feel. I certainly feel it's a complete film, memorable film, blew everyone's socks off, was dominating the world around the same time as Harry Potter. Again, in memory, there was, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Matrix. It was a really exciting time for movies and cinema. So the next 2 movies within the trilogy, so Two Towers and then Return of the King. Two Towers really, it picks up where Fellowship finishes. So you have Gilmy and you have Aragorn and you have...
And Legolas, the elf,
running through the New Zealand hills and landscape to go and rescue the other 2 hobbits. But is there anything in particular about Two Towers that you remember or that you think were impressive? Because, if you do a little bit of research, there's some debate out there that Two Towers is the best out of the 3.
Yeah, which is unusual for a middle film. And we get annoyed these days when our films have cliffhangers at the end, but I think everyone understood that was the structure of the books. Look, the Two Towers are the 2 evil towers in Gondor and Saruman's tower, who was a wizard turned evil. And it's a lot of it's the story about them, but it's also... about the breaking up of the Fellowship and how they all go their own way and sort of setting up for the big finale in the 3rd movie. So it's a bit of a setup movie, but it holds its own. And you're right, some people believe it's the best of the 3, probably from a lot of the action and the special effects. But again, didn't quite have the payoff at the end because it's still leaving a cliffhanger point. They're about to have the final confrontation with evil in the 3rd.
Yeah, and I think it was given it was the middle movie. I still, having watched it recently, as in 2 days ago, the first had, unique sort of emotions to it, and sort of, made you feel a certain way. And then Two Towers sort of set this relentless pace, like it was continuous, similar to what Christopher Nolan...
It was all about the chase and setting up the war.
Yeah, it starts on the chase and it continues on. The battle scenes are awesome. They really hold up, because it's a lot of close action shots of orcs and the Fellowship and knights battling. And there's not as many battles as in the 3rd movie, Return of the King. It's a really tight movie. And I think you're introduced a lot more characters. Now, I'm not going to even attempt to try and name new characters. I couldn't even name some of the standard characters, but the complexity of the world to grow.
Yeah. The first one sort of starts in the Shire, which is sort of this little, separate enclave. And so you sort of get this feeling of closeness, whereas now you're getting a feeling of the enormity of this world and all the creatures in it. So there's the Ents, for example, the walking tree, and there's the horsemen of Rohan and so on. And so you've got all of these new elements and new kingdoms, effectively, and new creatures coming into the story. So it's expansive in that sense, absolutely.
Yeah. And then we end with Return of the King, the last movie of the trilogy. And at 320 minutes, that is such an epic finale in terms of the three movies. And again, you're introduced with more characters. There is multiple battles throughout. There's certain parts of it that where the production design and the CGI is, really trying to ramp up sort of the breadth and the number of creatures in a battle scene. But it really just shows you that the sheer scale of the production they were able to achieve, certainly, within the third movie, but across all three movies. And so what do you think they did so well for the fantasy genre? Because, again, when I rewatched the movies, I wasn't a big Game of Thrones fan. I sort of watched the first season, but again, from memory, I couldn't think of anything else after Lord of the Rings that was done to the quality of the production or the intensity of the storytelling up until recently, 5 years ago with Lord of the Rings. Sorry, Game of Thrones. So from memory or from, recent experience, is there anything in particular around the fantasy genre that you think Lord of the Rings did well?
In my mind, you've got to sort of combine fantasy and sci-fi. They often are combined, and it's part of the same sort of, whatever the opposite of subgenre is, huge genre, overarching genre. And so Lord of the Rings showed what could be done with visual effects. It showed what could be done with the right budget and the right director that had the right passion for it, which hadn't been done in fantasy or sci-fi all that much in the past. We'd had some great sci-fi movies, 2001: A Space Odyssey and all those sort of things, but they were sort of one-off hits. Yeah. So I think the successes, you mentioned Harry Potter, and Harry Potter was around about the same time. I remember we took over our first cinema. We took it over the day we had a Harry Potter on the 14th of November, and then 6 weeks later we had the second Lord of the Rings. So both of them were operating and training, again, taking a beloved book and realising it on the big screen was an important change for audiences that they hadn't really seen that. Game of Thrones, I read the Game of Thrones book 10 years before it came out, and then when everyone got upset about the Red Wedding, I said, well, yeah, I know, I was upset when I read the book, but that was 10 years ago. And it did it more on a TV than a big screen point of view. But on the big screen, you've had I think Avatar is the obvious successor. Two of the biggest movies of all time, with the latest one last summer. They are the obvious successes in terms of some of the special effects, visual effects, and all that sort of thing. But we've also, and I can't necessarily name them off the top of my head, but we've had Hunger Games, we've had a few other dystopian type series that have been huge, and the Twilight series, etc. That are all part of that same overall genre that have been huge money makers for the studios, huge franchises, and have benefited from what Lord of the Rings did. So there've been quite a few of those big franchises.
Thinking about the length of it all, and what do you think about back when Lord of the Rings was released, the runtime for Lord of the Rings? I don't know, prior to that, in sort of recent memory of the cinema goers, a movie of at the 3 hour mark had been released. You mentioned Avatar, that was quite long, but going back and watching all three films was definitely a significant effort. I had late nights Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and so did my wife. But what do you think the runtime says about these types of movies, and how audiences either are happy to continue with that runtime or see it as something that will slowly change over time or diminish?
Look, I think there's lots in that. The runtime's a real issue for cinema owners. We prefer to see shorter movies because we can fit more sessions in. But for the right movie, whether it's an Avatar or a Lord of the Rings, that is going to be very popular, I think people appreciate the epic scale of those movies requires some time to tell them. On the other hand, we have other movies now that are hitting the 3+ hour movie mark that are being made that are arguably a bit self-indulgent from the directors. And so, audience is a little bit less wanting to, happy to sit there for 3 hours and watch them. So there needs to be a balance. And if it's going to take you 3+ hours to tell a story, one of the beauties of movies is the fact that, in roughly 2 to 2.5 hours, you can tell a complete story. That's very different to a series on Netflix where they'll often take a 2-hour movie and stretch it into, 8 1-hour episodes. Yeah, they move a lot slower. A movie should be crafted to be done in 2 to maybe 2.5 hours. But the really special ones, the Lord of the Rings, the Avatars, and so on, they can justify that 3-hour running time.
Yeah, and to add, I suppose my point is that epic films over the 2.5 hour, 3-hour mark, there's some of them you can definitely feel the length. Feel that recent example is Babylon. Just a remarkable movie. It just felt half an hour too long. I'm sure that the director had grand inspirations and wanted to realize his whole vision. So that was Babylon, Damien Chazelle, famous from La La Land and Whiplash, an auteur director, and he has a vision, has a budget, and goes all out. Remarkable filmmaking. But I watched it recently and just felt like that half an hour too long. And it's a shame because you don't want to think about that when you're in a movie. And going back, watching Lord of the Rings, sitting down and watching that movie 3 hours long, just given the amount of characters, the complexity of the storyline, the journey that they go through certainly in the first Fellowship of the Rings, it's enthralling. It's magic cinema, magic cinema experience. However, it just doesn't feel as long as that 3-hour mark. And I suppose with Flower Moon, I really, I felt that time really stretched. I felt as though there were moments that I'd seen before within the movie, and I am by no means critiquing Martin Scorsese's choices. However, you can really feel it. And, if you were it'd be interesting to see the response you'd get if you reran Lord of the Rings at a cinema, see the dynamic difference in the generations, and see how popular that would be in the the younger generations. I do fear that, some of these auteurs that are getting the opportunity to release these big thematic movies out on, the 3-hour mark, is that making an effect to cinema goers? I'm not sure. But, if I can compare Lord of the Rings, watching that recently, that type of film and the way it was made, compared to something like Killers of the Flower Moon or Babylon, the experience was just very different.
I think the two are quite different. In Lord of the Rings, it was a 100-year-old, one of the most revered texts, second perhaps only to the Bible, in reverence to it. And you have a lot of people like me who are absolute Tolkien nerds who, if they cut too much out or anything out of the books, would have been up in arms. And the same happened with Harry Potter. We found that my daughter was a real Harry Potter fan, and if they changed stuff from the books, she would be up in arms. So there was a real fan base that they had to cater for, as opposed to Killers of the Flower Moon, where, with most movies that adapt from books, they will take they'll cut some bits out. They'll make sure that they get the story told in the time frame. And I think Scorsese's a master filmmaker. I thought it was a brilliant film. I saw it yesterday as well, and a brilliant film. And it didn't feel too long in many ways because it gripped you the whole way through. But you also felt it was 3 hours, 26 minutes. It could have been easily kept to 3 hours or less without losing the essence of the story. And I think that's what we've lost in the art of filmmaking in the last few years as we've changed to digital and the directors have got more power in the studios, that we're seeing these movies times blow out, and it's not as tight storytelling as perhaps it used to be. Having said that, you go back to movies like Gone with the Wind that were like 4 hours and so on back in history. So long movies are not new. But in the old days, it used to cost every foot of film, it would cost a certain amount of, they were made of silver nitrate and so on. And they would have to very carefully make a decision whether to do it longer. These days, it's all digital files. A lot of those cost things don't come into it. So there's lots of things that play the whole length of film.
Yeah, and definitely not comparing the two. And I was also gripped, and you can just see the mastery of Scorsese and co. Killers of the Flower Moon. It was just, I suppose the length of the film and experiencing the film felt a bit different. So thanks for sharing about Lord of the Rings. There's quite a bit in there. I'll readjust some of the order that we explained. Lord of the Rings and the career of Peter Jackson. But on the Movie Health podcast, we also talk about mental health. So just like to mention that when we started to explore the concept of movies and mental health and this concept of movie therapy, where you can use the tool of the movie to have a conversation about mental health or mental illness. You've been a really great supporter of me and movie as we sort of explore how might we use movies for mental health. So either associated to movies or in your personal life, what are some of your tips for mental health? So maintaining mental health.
For me, and one of the reasons that I was so keen to embrace the concept is that for me, sitting in a cinema watching a movie has always been, since I was a teenager, a mental health thing for me. You think about it, it's in these modern days, it's the only time that you turn off your phone, that you have to turn off your phone pretty much. It's the only time that you can look at a big screen and can immerse yourself in the story. Watching something at home, I was never able to watch movies at home, and I still struggle with it. I can watch a TV series that I'm sort of half interested in and get the gist of it and whatever, but I'm always, perhaps I've got ADHD. My son tells me that I've got to be doing multiple things. So I'm checking my emails on my phone, on my iPad, on both at the same time, as well as watching something at home. Whereas in the cinema, I have to focus on the story and so on. And I find that a real escape. And we all have the pressures of day-to-day life, and the escape of going to the movies has always been a key one for me, well before I even contemplated that I would own any cinemas. So I've always loved that. On the other side, for me, while I wouldn't call myself supremely fit or anything, I've always tried to maintain a good physical side, whether it's going for a walk or a run or a bike ride, playing team sports. I've always been a team sport player, being part of a team. And I've always talked about that, I play hockey. I have since I was 7 years old, which is over 50 years to age myself. And I'm still playing now. And I see that as a real stress relief. Bit of white line fever when I cross the line. I can be a slightly different person sometimes, particularly the umpires might say that. But I'm not too bad these days, a bit more mellow. But it's just, it gets the adrenaline going and out there, but it's also being part of the team. So, I've never been a good just runner or swimmer or anything like that. I always wanted to have a bat and a ball of some sort and be running around with a team. I played a lot of squash as well and find a partner to play squash with. So it's the camaraderie of that as well as the exercise and all of that. So, I think from a mental health point of view that sport and exercise are, to me, are extremely important.
Yeah. Well, thank you. There's a combination of movies and sport. I could definitely relate to both. I continue to go to the movies by myself or with friends and totally agree. It's such an escape to switch off and enjoy something like a movie. And then, that it's super important to go out and maintain your physical and mental health. So, Kieran, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate talking about Lord of the Rings and revisiting all three recently. I really enjoyed it and hope to do it again in the near future. But I think I need a bit of a rest from orcs and fairies and wizards and goblins.
No fairies in Lord of the Rings, they're elves.
Oh, there you go. I wasn't paying attention. All right, mate. Well, thank you so much and take care.
No problems. Thanks, AJ.